Hello, everyone. Good afternoon. Thank you for joining today's webinar with the Tribal Law and Policy Institute. Today, our webinar is on tribal domestic violence courts and dockets. It's the second in a series of webinars that we're doing on tribal domestic violence courts and dockets. Today, I am pleased to introduce our presenters, Bonnie Claremont, a victim advocacy program specialist with the Tribal Law and Policy Institute, and the Honorable Kelly Gaines Stoner, victim advocacy legal specialist at the Tribal Law and Policy Institute, and she is also a judge at the Seminole Nation of Oklahoma. And with that, I'm going to turn it over to Kelly.
Thank you, and welcome everyone. We're so happy that you're here. This is one of our favorite topics. If we could go through these learning objectives just really quickly at the end of the presentation, if we've done what we're supposed to do, you should be able to compare and contrast the differences, similarities and differences between a domestic violence docket and a domestic violence court, because I think in the past the terms have been used rather loosely and they do mean different things. You should be able to explain a little bit about the history of domestic violence courts and dockets, identify core values. That's a word we're really using. We tossed around key principles and decided that principles might be something that could be changed and manipulated, and these values that we're going to be talking about today that are attached to a domestic violence court or a domestic violence docket are really the essence of the court itself, and they really are not subject to change. And we'll talk more about that as we get into the PowerPoint. You should be able to understand the role that tribal custom and tradition plays in developing and agreeing on what those core values are going to be in a domestic violence court or a domestic violence docket. Understand the role of tribal custom and tradition as you are developing the domestic violence court or docket. Identify several benefits of a domestic violence court. Then we want you to be able to identify through the multidisciplinary lens the holistic approach to victim safety and the holistic approach to batterer accountability. All of these are essential in developing and implementing a domestic violence court or a domestic violence docket. So I'll start with the first couple of slides here, and hopefully this is going to meet our objective, because when you're talking about or focusing thinking, trying to make that decision on whether your community would most benefit from a domestic violence court or docket, here are the earmarks of a domestic violence docket. It's typically characterized by setting aside specific days or weeks, depending on how heavy your docket is, of the tribal docket, and during those specific set aside times, the only cases that will be being heard by the court are domestic violence cases. And tribes can do this in a variety of different ways, but that's with respect to what kind of cases the court's going to hear. But typically this is really focused on the docket, and the docket being specifically designed to address domestic violence cases. What this does is allow for continuity for the victims. They know what days they need to go to court. They know what days their cases are going to be heard. Hopefully there'll be some sort of continuity with respect to the court staff that they're going to encounter. It also allows the court to, if the tribe so chooses, to address domestic violence civil, such as getting a protection order, such as a custody case that involves domestic violence, and the criminal, such as violation of protection orders, such as violation of court orders even. It allows the court to address all of those DV issues on the same day during this specific set-aside time period. A really important piece of a domestic violence docket is it also allows for enhanced security. A lot of things happen in the parking lots. outside of courthouses, and tribal courts are no exception. So we need the victim to be able to arrive at the court safely, get into the court safely, and exit the court safely, and hopefully have a safe trip home. It also allows not only for the victim's safety issues to be addressed, but also the safety issues of the court itself, that it allows perhaps a specifically trained bailiff to be present. It allows for court staff to be monitoring on heightened alert with respect to, the ongoings of the court, the filing of paperwork and things like that. It also allows for that victim advocate to say, these days of my calendar are blocked out because it's PO day at court, or it's DV day at court, and I'm going to be able to be there all day or have a substitute there all day so that we can address the needs of these victims as they're having to go into the courtroom. And oftentimes you'll find that tribal courts will also provide child care for victims, knowing that oftentimes these victims don't have the funds for child care and sometimes have to take off work. And if their children are out of school, if it's summer, they'll have their children with them. So it's an accommodating court focused on DV, this docket day, excuse me. The next slide is going to talk about, provide more information on domestic violence courts. These are specialized courts. They're the entire package, and we'll talk more about what this package includes, but every person involved in this specialized court has been well trained. The caseload has been designed to meet the needs of the tribal community. And we can talk about the different models later if you have questions, but an earmark also of a domestic violence court is that every individual, every collaborative partner, which is going to be multidisciplinary, has been well trained to screen, to recognize domestic violence power and control techniques, the manipulative behaviors of the batterer, and all of the team that work in this court have committed. They've committed their efforts and their protocols towards victim safety and batterer accountability. And another thing that a domestic violence court does, and it has a responsibility to do, and it is a focus of the court. This is what makes a DV court different than other courts. It is focused at all times on victim safety, including the safety of the children. We should probably also include in there the safety of all collaborative partners and the judge. It's focused on safety and batterer accountability. The court is committed, and one of its missions will be, one of those core values, closely monitoring that batterer's compliance with court orders. So as you can see, there's a real difference between a domestic violence docket and a domestic violence court. And the history of domestic violence courts is notably non-tribal. It's developed over, let's say, the past few decades. I think a lot of this had to do with the movement in the field of domestic violence. And so let's just focus on the development in the 90s of these problem-solving courts, because I've heard it said, and I believe I might have been one of the people who said it, but I'm going to walk back on my statements, that a domestic violence court is like a distant cousin to the drug court. And I think after further literature review and just kind of mulling this over, especially with my esteemed co-presenter, I think that's an incorrect statement, because the drug courts, the mental health courts, the community courts, the family courts, those problem-solving courts really are focused on the defendant and what the defendant needs to address a certain issue, such as the drug use. So it's focusing more on what the defendant needs and whether the defendant's complying. Think about what I just told you about a domestic violence court, because that is not what a domestic violence court is doing. That is not one of the core values of a domestic violence court. The domestic violence court has a responsibility to the victim, and I would even argue the victim's children. The victim comes first. And while the courts will monitor the batterer's behavior, that does not mean that the batterer eventually is going to be able to go back into the home. The first and foremost responsibility of a domestic violence court is victim safety and to meet the service needs of the victim and the children so they are less traumatized and have all the services in place necessary to maintain their standard of living and to hopefully heal from the trauma that they have been exposed to. So I wanted to draw that distinction there. And I think also in the drug courts, in those problem-solving courts, typically the ones I've run across and been involved in, they did not, you weren't eligible to participate in the problem-solving court if you'd had any sort of violent behavior. And we all know that in a domestic violence case, there are all types of violent behaviors that we see the perpetrators exhibiting. So the domestic violence courts that we do have that are on record, that there's literature out there, that they've got manuals online, they are well established. They're different. They I guess depending on the resources available, what the state needed or the community within the state needed at the time the domestic violence court was developed, you're going to see a variety of different models, with some courts hearing only protection orders, issuing protection orders, maybe addressing protection order violations. Some domestic violence courts are going to address the protection order and the violations and also hear all civil cases that involve domestic violence. And then you'll get some courts running the gamut saying any case, civil or criminal, that involves domestic violence will be in the domestic violence court with our specially trained team. And do you want to do this one, Bonnie?
Sure. Okay, so core values guiding a domestic violence court / docket. As Kelly said, the domestic violence courts are victim-centered, victim-driven, and sort of a guiding principle is how will this practice or this ruling or this expectation impact a victim and the children involved in this situation. So it really looks at what's currently happened within that domestic violence that's occurred, and then what needs to happen to keep that family safe or keep the victim safe. In most instances, it's a woman, and what is needed to keep her safe and her children. And the sooner that can be done, the better. So it's really important that early screening happens. And domestic violence is so prevalent in our tribal communities that it's kind of a training issue, but also just a community-wide awareness issue that all aspects of the community are aware of the indicators, are aware of the red flags, so that the sooner the better, the sooner that the victim can access services and access safety, the better. And so, I believe that even family relatives are first responders. And so the more educated that everyone can be on this issue, the better the outcomes, especially for the victim and the children involved. And in that sense, it's really important that there are services that
can meet the needs of victims of domestic violence, those wraparound services, including social services for the victim and the children. So looking at what are the needs, what are the potential needs of a battered woman leaving that situation, when, you know, she's displaced, when resources are sort of are held, especially if the home is in the batterer's name. You know, she's had to flee without the children, but you know, ultimately the children should be with her. And you know, what's need to be put in place in order for that to happen. So looking at even housing policies, housing, you know, availability, I think it would be good that even housing officials are part of the CCR to put in place policies that if there's vacancies, perhaps maybe sort of triaging the need for battered women to have decent, affordable housing within the community. And also the health needs. Battered women have many need for medical services, even on a long-term basis. Oftentimes there's injuries that have gone untreated and so forth. So local medical service providers need to be aware of that. And a few of these are listed, some of the more long-term health needs that battered women may have. So it's really important to look beyond the immediate sort of responders, but to look at what additional kind of services are needed so that when these you know, when these cases come to the court, that there's you know, an awareness of the needs that this battered woman may have. So in order to, I think a domestic violence court is a really good place for that to happen, so that all, you know, all aspects of those needs are covered. And then also keeping the victim informed. And this is one of the things that advocates are really, I guess, just skilled at, is to know the resources, to know the system well enough and all of the key players within the system and what happens at each juncture. It's the advocate that's with that victim continually. So the role of the advocate is really important in these situations, in having a successful domestic violence or court or a docket, that an advocate can be there and also to keep the victim informed. And then also where that advocate can work with the clerk of courts and everyone else, so that everyone is sort of on the same wavelength as far as the needs of the victim and the need to keep that victim informed of all proceedings and all the rulings and what they mean. And also to schedule cases punctually. To you know, it's really critical when you have a victim there and cases are running late, and we have a perpetrator and the perpetrator's family if they're there, and it's important to really maintain a punctual court docket and cases seen in the court. And then also to have safe places for the victim within that setting, within the courthouse, and also to educate all the key players within that setting, whether it's court clerks or bailiffs or whoever it is, to keep them well trained and well understanding of the nuances and the volatility of these situations, because it's based on issues of power and control, the perpetrator wanting power and control. And if this victim is being empowered and is wanting to get out of that situation, oftentimes it can result in a really volatile situation where that perpetrator is going to be angry towards everyone involved for coming between him and his partner. So it's really important that all people within that setting are well trained on the volatility of these cases. So it'd be important to have like meeting space for where a victim can wait or meet with an advocate before the hearing happens and so forth, so that there's safe places even within the courthouse.
Thanks, Bonnie. And one of the things I just want to reiterate, and I'll probably say this several times, as Bonnie and she and I were putting together the PowerPoint presentation again, we really like the word core values. And I think if you look back at the other slide, it says victim safety, driven. And what that means is if this court is not committed to that, then it doesn't need to happen. You don't need a DV court if that is not going to be one of the core values. No budging. Everyone on this collaborative team we're going to talk about later agrees that victim safety has the highest priority. Also, a core value is offender accountability, because a domestic violence court will not be effective at hopefully reducing domestic violence across the community, but certainly in providing these services and in a safe way, in a trauma-informed way to the victim and the children, if we don't have batterer accountability. And we're going to talk more about that a little bit later, but I want to mention some points here that will assist in reaching that core value of the domestic violence court, where you have one permanent judge, one judge. Because what that does, in a bigger court you might have several, but at least one, so that when the batterer comes in and begins utilizing his preferred manipulative technique in the power and control wheel, the judge, already educated in the dynamics of domestic violence, understanding the victim safety issues, can tailor the court order effectively to address offender accountability. There needs to be a fixed prosecutorial team if this domestic violence court is going to hear criminal cases such as protection order violations or assaults against the victim, which include domestic violence. I would argue would also be within the realm of a domestic violence court. And this team of prosecutors, or just one, if that's all the resources that the tribe has, is trained and committed to these core values, that victim safety is going to come first and offender accountability is right there underneath victim safety. The law enforcement team has to be regular, has to be consistent, has to be those law enforcement DV investigators, DV probation officers, and understand the importance, the key importance of offender accountability, tracking it, reporting it back to the court in a very timely manner in order for this domestic violence court to really be effective. There has to be, as I said earlier, continual monitoring of the batterer. All violations have to be reported. There have to be creative monitoring techniques, whether it's did the person sign in at the batterer intervention program on time? Were they late? Anything that the judge has ordered this batterer to do, there has to be a team effort designed at continually monitoring the batterer and the batterer's compliance with the orders. Because one thing we know is that court orders, when they're drafted appropriately, take some of the power and control away from the batterer. And so typically what you would imagine would happen in that type of hypothetical is once that power and control is taken from the batterer is going to take it back in some way, and it's usually by violating some of the smallest provisions of the order, such as if the court order says the batterer may contact the victim by phone for a particular purpose between the hours of 2 and 4, the batterer won't call that time, he'll call different times. It's an issue of power and control. And so this group of people working in this court get that. They're monitoring it. And if there are so many violations, even the tiniest little ones that are being handled in the court, they can have a separate overflow docket for just violations of a civil order if necessary. But this is one of those core values we talked about at the beginning. You really can't have a domestic violence court without this core value. We also have core values with respect to a domestic violence court that Bonnie mentioned earlier as a CCR, also called multidisciplinary teams sometimes. And that is the approach that a domestic violence court, that's one of the core values, the underpinnings, is that it's going to take us all. If we are going to effectuate victim healing. We're going to provide victim-centered services. Victim safety is our top priority, and we're going to do continuous monitoring of this batterer, and there will be consequences for violations. It takes a commitment from a minimum of the collaborators we're going to list for you here. I'm going to start with judicial leadership. It is up to the judge to set the tone, and the judge needs to take it seriously. The judge needs to be the type of individual who thinks that, well, I went to law school, I got a law degree, I don't need to learn anything else. That's not the kind of judge we're looking for. This judge and every single member of this multidisciplinary team, or this multidisciplinary collaboration, whatever you want to call it, in the domestic violence court, one of the underpinnings of this is they need regular and ongoing training in the dynamics of domestic violence and successful ways that domestic violence is effectively being reduced. They need to have an open mind. They need to have training on drafting protection orders in a way that maximizes victim safety. So we're looking for that one judge or a few judges that will step up and be accountable, be willing to learn, and will also hold the other collaborative members of his or her domestic violence court accountable. You will be here, we will attend training together, and we will discuss issues we are having at regular meetings. So there'll be some other partners we're going to talk about, but I want the judicial leadership is imperative. Hopefully this judicial leadership will culminate in collaborative relationships with advocates who are going to be part of the DV court, tribal prosecutors, law enforcement, social services, child protection, healthcare. You can read the whole list there. That doesn't mean that they have to be at every single domestic violence court day or docket, but what it means is they will come to the meetings. They will all be on the same page with respect to victim safety, batterer accountability, and the protocols that each discipline is using to prevent further traumatization of the victim and the children. And as I mentioned earlier, you can't say it enough, education and training for all. If you run across a judge or one of the DV court collaborative partners that are not willing to engage in regular and ongoing trainings with respect to DV and victim safety and batterer accountability, you don't have the makings of a domestic violence court. You need committed people. Bonnie, I think this one's yours.
Okay, I wanted to just comment on the previous slide for just to reiterate or to reinforce that for advocates, like I said before, because advocates sort of are there at every juncture of this process, chances are, because in most cases, the victim's entry point into the system is maybe perhaps through the advocacy program or with law enforcement, and then hopefully there's a strong working relationship between law enforcement and the advocacy program. But because that advocate is the sort of the constant in this process, it's really important in most tribal communities. It's advocates who sort of keep a watchful eye on all of these the wheels that turn, and if they're not turning well in one area, again, advocates, part of their job is to do systems change, to see what's needed here. Is it a training issue? If it's something that has worked to the detriment of a victim, is that a training issue? So again, training is really important, but it's really critical for advocates to create and foster a really strong working relationship with all of these agencies. And as we know, there's oftentimes advocacy programs are really under-resourced, if the tribe even has an advocacy program, which I just hope that if a DV court is set in place, that there is an advocacy program to to be instrumental in this process. So I can't even imagine doing this without an advocate. So I just wanted to say that advocates play a critical role in working with victims and to, again, help empower victims and to provide the training that's needed. Because in this slide here, we talk about the role of tribal custom and traditions in developing our core values. As Indian people, I truly believe we didn't have the problem of domestic violence that we have today, because we had equality between genders and respect across genders and across generations. So we didn't need domestic violence courts. But today we do. We see the problem of gender violence, and that's part of the training that also needs to happen, that this problem is coming from somewhere, so we need to address where it's coming from, rather than always using sort of a more Band-Aid approach. We need to look at the source of the problem. So keeping, our first concern, our first priority is safety and protection for the victim. And like I said before, a guiding question, a guiding principle that people need to continue to ask as they develop these, as they operate DV courts, is how is this going to impact safety for the victim? Is this safe for the victim? How can we make this safer? So safety being number one concern. And as I said, violence is not in keeping with our tribal customs and traditions. So along with that, I strongly believe in tribes having a strong DV code that incorporates all of these beliefs and customs and traditions, that it's written. It's like the first words within a tribal DV code to say this, we have to have this code because, this is not in keeping, domestic violence is not in keeping with our tribal customs and traditions. Everyone at the table within a team, and as this process continues, really needs to understand that victims deserve, a quick response, early response, a prompt response, and also one that is based on fair and compassionate considerations. Because, in our tribal communities, they're for the most part are pretty closed communities, sort of a little bit enmeshed. People have, their political persuasions, and they have the cliques and the family feuds, and if somebody's doing something over here, I don't want to say anything because that's my relative, and and when that happens, I think that's where we're setting up victims for a lot of harm. And oftentimes there has to be something that happens before we understand, no, we can't operate that. It has to be based on fairness, despite who it is, especially, if you have a protection order in place and there's violation, people need to step forward, whether it's bystanders, whether it's law enforcement making just a traffic stop or whatever, that there needs to be an awareness when these things happen, or is called to a home for a wild party and the batterer is there, and it's important to be aware that that's not supposed to be happening, and arrest that person for violation. Even if that person is related to the law enforcement person, to be able to set aside those biases. And overall, it threatens our political integrity as a tribe. Our families, our homes are women-centered. It's the woman that basically kind of runs the home. If the home isn't, the woman isn't healthy and strong, the children aren't going to be. That home isn't going to be. If that home isn't, then the community, the village is not going to be. So it's at everyone's best interest to create that kind of health and strength within that family. And we have the ability to utilize our own systems, our own criminal and civil justice systems to do so, and we can make it tailored to the needs of the customs of the tribe within each tribe. So we have that. We also have that the right to do that based on our tribal sovereignty and our authority. Okay. And I think I've said some of this, and I think it just bears repeating that everything that we do is based on the safety and well-being of victims of domestic violence and their children. And, even training in terms of the impact of domestic violence on children, so that people really understand that children who witness violence, who witness domestic violence, are impacted and can have a long-term impact, just even based on, their behavior and how well they may do or may not do in school, health problems that they may experience from just witnessing domestic violence. And also the mother-child bond. Oftentimes children are used as sort of a pawn in these situations. The batterer using the children to get at the woman. So it's important for all people within this setting, within the domestic violence court, to understand that dynamic and to do all that's possible to strengthen that mother-child bond, because it is a sacred bond, and to look at how can that happen. And of course, that means custody, to look at temporary custody, and then legal services for the battered woman to retain custody.
Want me to take this one, Bonnie?
Sure.
Okay, we wanted to list out some of the benefits. These are just a few of the benefits of a domestic violence court. I think you can reflect on some of the things that Bonnie said and perhaps that I've said early on, and you begin to see the picture of this is a different approach to addressing domestic violence in a trauma-informed, victim-centered light. So one of the things that is very important for an effective tribal domestic violence court is to have informed judicial decision making. And I don't think we get that in all cases, in many cases involving domestic violence. And what I mean by informed judicial decision making is where the judge is making decisions based on a solid foundation of the power and control wheel, and realizing that everything that is written on that paper, the remedies, the findings, all of it may have some effect, will have some effect on the safety of the victim and the children. And also the informed judicial decision maker should also be considering what Bonnie was just talking about earlier with respect to each tribe's unique customs and traditions with respect to healthy family and mother-child bonding, and incorporating those tribal customs and traditions into the court order. We've mentioned how important I think the judge is, and that the judge has got training. I think in many instances, it's not just the training on the dynamics of domestic violence and the victim safety issue, though. We need to go further, and we need to understand what VAWA, full faith and credit provisions, what that looks like. And we need to talk about subject matter jurisdiction in Indian country. It's necessary. And I always have a pet peeve about check the box forms, especially when we're talking about civil jurisdiction over non-members in Indian country. And I know that VAWA went a long way in clarifying that, but for some tribes in certain areas with checkerboarded jurisdictions and no reservations, we still need those judges to step up and write what needs to be written so that we will get an enforceable protection order. Again, talking about a single presiding judge so that there's less chance of manipulation on the part of the batterer. We've got court, everyone is trained, everyone is on the same page. We've got victim advocates who are there, who are working the courtroom for safety issues, working to make sure the victim's voice is heard, that the victim isn't being intimidated, that we are truly getting the victim's story, that the victim wishes to share with us. And I agree with Bonnie 100%. As we go a little bit further down here, and you're going to see some suggested roles for each of these multidisciplinary partners in a domestic violence court, you're going to see that the cornerstone is really the tribal victim advocate, just as Bonnie said. So this whole group it's going to be calling on these victim advocates, the tribal victim advocates, to work in a variety of different areas, not only victim and child safety, but also in the safety of the courtroom and meeting the needs of the victim in the courtroom, and all of those issues. Multidisciplinary linkage to the service providers, and they may vary from case to case, but as I said, there will be this ongoing meeting, open dialogue between all of these service providers, and those voices from all the disciplines need to be heard to actually design this domestic violence court to meet the needs of each tribal community. So lots of benefits there. And we continue with the benefits. If it's done correctly, it should improve collaboration among service providers. It, at a minimum, gets everyone on the same page with respect to victim safety and the power and control mechanisms the batterer is using in each case. Improved community response to domestic violence by linking a family court with justice personnel, tribal victim advocates. And as Bonnie mentioned earlier, advocates are one of their roles. They have many roles, but one of their roles is system change. This is one way to do it, is with the DV court, is that you are working across disciplines to get everyone on the same page with respect to safety issues, dynamics of domestic violence, and the judge is using all of the tools in the judicial toolbox to issue the strongest orders that are going to support victim safety. We've got batterer accountability going, and everybody gets it, and everybody's watching for it. And I do want to say a word here. We didn't have time to really go into the sharing of information. That needs to be done very, very carefully so that we are not waiving privileges, compromising confidentiality, which is directly tied to victim safety. But there is a way to do it, and if it's done correctly, it can be extremely powerful. In domestic violence cases, Bonnie mentioned this earlier in her presentation, there's early identification. It happens earlier in the process. Identifying domestic violence is the red flags are there. We need a screening from the advocate, and let's get these services going right away. And when you have the non-rotating personnel, again, less chance for that batterer to manipulate. And so we've got all these systems on the same page, working together, getting stronger, being more victim-centered, safety-oriented, and lots of benefits. Hopefully the community is getting stronger as a result. And when we talk about this multidisciplinary approach in a domestic violence court, it underscores just how important that all systems are in addressing the victim's needs and service needs and safety needs, and also reducing domestic violence as a whole in the community. I mentioned here again that the tailoring of the information, the sharing, that's going to be a point of contention, I would anticipate. So, but there are workarounds to it, and there are ways to do it in that where it can still be very effective. So remember that when you're bringing all these disciplines together, that confidentiality and the privilege and the sharing of information is a unique area where you may need technical assistance to make sure that you have done that in a correct and safe way for the victim. So we're hoping again that once we get the advocates in there and we get the community education training going and all the disciplinary, the different discipline trainings going, that we will have healthier tribal communities with respect to domestic violence. And now we begin to list out, okay, we've told you all of these, the differences between the DV court and docket. We've talked to you about the history of domestic violence courts and the multidisciplinary. It's really an underpinning, it's a cornerstone of these disciplines coming together to work together. And then we sort of listed out just a few of these disciplines that we felt were core, that you had to have, and then you can add to or take away as each case is different. But again, I've done my spiel on judicial leadership. My second one is that the tribal judge will apply the tribal statutes correctly, actually. And I say that knowing very well that there are some very talented tribal court judges out there, very astute. However, we also have judges who move from court to court, again, depending on the resources, and they're not from that particular tribal community where they're a judge. And just a reminder to these judges to go back and read the code. Each code is different. And as Bonnie said, it's so critical to have a well-developed tribal code that exhibits, that emulates the tribal customs and traditions with respect to the family and domestic violence. So we need the drafting of the legal documents to be spot on in these cases. And we need the judge to really take seriously the safety issues with respect to courtroom safety, courtroom personnel safety. It's not okay to say, well, today the bailiff is ill, we only had one, so we'll just go on without a bailiff. We need a substitute. We need plan A, B, C. We need someone there. We need to make safety a priority. We need a judge that will step up and say, I will hear these protection order violations. Prosecutor, bring these in. These are important. They're an very important piece of a domestic violence court. Also, drafting those legal documents where, due to some of the restrictions placed on a tribe's sentencing authority in the Indian Civil Rights Act, judges that are educated and trained and being victim-centered are constantly talking with advocate and saying to the entire collaborative team here and saying, well, I'm going to draft this order. I can only do misdemeanor here, but I'm going to also put these other elements in because this is a very serious crime. And on the federal level, clearly it would have been a felony. So I'm going to draft this order so that this order at least becomes one in several that might lead to a habitual offender federal conviction later, using all of those tools. And also the judicial component of this needs to be responsible for the court's accountability. If the court isn't monitoring, if the court isn't listening or insisting that these violations, even minor violations, are coming before the court isn't going to operate effectively. So it needs to be taken extremely seriously. That's one of the core values of a domestic violence court. Again, I've already talked about the training. This is for every single discipline. If you find people who are not willing to go to regular periodic trainings that are going to continue throughout the lifetime of the domestic violence court, I would urge you to reconsider if you have the right person. When we talk about court personnel, we have to talk generally, because in some tribal courts, the court itself is heard in another building because perhaps there's not enough resources for a formal separate tribal court, and that leaves court personnel in a different unit. And oftentimes these units where court personnel are located, those units might be there'll be a sheet of glass between the clerk or the person taking the paperwork and the victim or the perpetrator. And glass is not soundproof. And so we need the court personnel. We need them to understand, first of all, about the foundational dynamics of DV and the safety issues that it presents to the victim and the children. But we also need them to understand about confidentiality and talking about these cases, perhaps even not using names, thinking no one will recognize this, because as Bonnie said, Indian communities, tribal communities are oftentimes very small and tight-knit, and I guarantee you that if you give enough facts, someone in that community is going to identify the case you're talking about. So we need that to be a real top priority, is confidentiality, and the training for the court staff. And they need a safety plan. The court staff needs to know, do we have a code to get in and out? Can anybody walk in? I know at Seminole, for example, I park behind the courthouse where there's no one there. There's no one monitoring it. That's probably a safety issue. So we need to be thinking about safety at all times when we're talking about the domestic violence court, the court personnel. And again, that you'll see that very last bullet in each one of these, because that is critical, that ongoing, consistent training. With respect to tribal prosecutors, again, you'll see a lot of the same things. This is not rocket science, but it's these core values that we're bringing up to you. These must be present and they must be ongoing. And I think prosecutors need to understand and enforce victims' rights. I think that's an area that is, in some cases, just almost being overlooked entirely. I think we need to have tribal codes that clearly set out victims' rights, who's responsible for enforcing those, and there needs to be some sort of mechanism, some committee, some body that these tribal victims' rights violations are being reported to, so that we can have some measure of accountability in that realm. We need the tribal prosecutors to understand that they have the authority, the power to ask the judge for a protection order in the realm of a no contact order, but the orders need to be drafted properly and meet the requirements of a protection order and the full faith and credit requirements and all of those other things, so that when there is a violation and we have continually ongoing batterer monitoring, it becomes not just a violation of that no contact provision. Now we're going to bring you back in and put you behind bars, but it's also a brand new crime that you could be prosecuted for. So we want the tribal prosecutors to step up in the DV court, though, and be accountable for their participation, for their level of expertise, and for their willingness to be trained in an ongoing way. Law enforcement, same thing. Everyone has to be on the same page with respect to DV and victim safety. Law enforcement officers really do need to be in the DV court really well trained on trauma and trauma effects on victims. I would think that all law enforcement officers would want that training, because they're investigating crimes that oftentimes include victims. I think also it's goes without saying almost that a law enforcement officer has to understand the crucial, critical, necessary, mandatory role, essential role of a victim advocate in these DV cases. And we need to have all of these partners collaborating so that that officer is letting that advocate know right away when there is a victim, and letting that victim know, hooking those two together so that we can get these services going early. And also that advocate is able to do an in-depth lethality assessment, so the officer gets some idea of, wow, this perpetrator has really been busy, and this is a pattern, and lethality is really getting high. And we need law enforcement to again be trained on the jurisdictional issues in Indian country, and the upcoming Section 904 of VAWA with the Special Domestic Violence Criminal Jurisdiction. Understand if the tribe is incorporating that they're understanding the mechanisms of how that works as well. And understand and enforce tribal domestic violence statutes. If it's written, there's a mandatory arrest, then mandatory arrest. no room for discretion in some of the tribal codes. So people need to go back and read those codes, refresh their memories. And if the group as a whole feels the code needs to be changed, perhaps they can give a recommendation to someone to make code modifications. Chia, are you there?
Yeah, I just changed it, I thought.
Okay, it's still on enforcement on my screen.
This slide has information about continued for law enforcement. And
I'm sorry. Yes, you're right. Okay, I'm sorry. And understanding the importance for law enforcement of getting these orders on NCIC, whatever workarounds being used. I know the TAP program's in full swing. Some tribal jurisdictions have entered into agreements with counties and with states to put this information on. The protection orders need to be loaded, and they need to be loaded as tribal protection orders. So law enforcement can really go a long way in making that happen if they understand the importance of that, and they're truly a collaborative partner in a domestic violence court. Again, ongoing training, and being accountable to the court. If the court brings the team together and there are issues with law enforcement, that we get law enforcement to explain some of the issues, and let's work it out. Let's find a workaround. Let's be on the same page. Defense attorneys, I wanted to add this often left out group. Difficult to envision that, yes, a defense attorney might be a part of our DV court team, but chances are they're going to be if there's any criminal work being done at all in the domestic violence court. We need the defense attorneys trained on the power and control dynamics to understand victim safety issues and to promote batterer compliance, because I don't know of many successful defense attorneys who, and it's unethical and unlawful for a defense attorney to encourage their client to go out and violate orders. But the defense attorney bar needs to understand this court is going to be monitoring, so they can take a step. The defense attorneys can make a step to educate their clients about, if you don't comply to the letter, there will be consequences. One of the great things that a defense counsel will do, the defense judicial system, is to put highlights on the weaknesses in the system. And the defendant's rights need to be protected. And if there are loopholes, weaknesses in the tribal code, the defense attorney should be fleshing those out, and let's make some changes. So everyone here does have a role, and they should receive ongoing consistent training regarding trauma-informed victim service delivery issues. They need to understand trauma. Bonnie, do you want to do this slide?
Hello. Oh, sorry about that. Yes, the role of the tribal victim advocate, to understand issues of power and control. And I think if anyone understands that, it would be the advocates. And in turn, they do a lot of training on the dynamics. So it's important that they, are able to train on it. And there's resources available to help train advocates to provide that type of training. And then safety planning for the victim. And the safety planning is really geared and streamlined to the needs of that victim, in terms of where are they going? Are they going to a shelter? Are they going home? Does he have access there? And if he shows up, what can she do? What are her resources? So it really is based on her needs, and then all of the what ifs that could happen. and to have her thinking about those things. And as we know, not all tribal communities have shelters available to them. So safety planning is really important in terms of even, who knows about her situation, who's her support system, and, where can she go if it's not safe for her to be home, and having a bag packed with her information, her identification, her children's papers, and so forth. Advocates also work at coordinating resources and services, and so it's really important for advocates to be aware of those resources that a battered woman may need, and also the children may need, and not only be aware of them, but have current information on how those agencies operate, their hours, if they have fees, and so forth, and to also go beyond that and to have working relationships with those agencies, so that when an advocate is making a referral to a battered woman, that she knows she can give that battered woman some accurate information, so that battered woman can make some informed decisions, informed consent. So it's really critical that advocates are aware of all of these resources and are keep an up-to-date directory of those resources that a battered woman may need. Community education on the dynamics and dangers of domestic violence. Advocates understand that, the most volatile time for battered women is when they leave, when they talk about leaving, when they make attempts to leave, because that's a threat to the batterer's power and control. And oftentimes the batterer will exert to the sort of the violence just escalates because that batterer is losing control, and situations can become more volatile and oftentimes become lethal. So it's important for the advocate to educate the community about that it's not just a squabble and a private issue between two people, but we've seen in the news all the time where batterers show up, and even in courtroom situations, and start shooting. So it's really important that the education is proactive, so that people are aware of the seriousness of these cases. And also to look at safety planning, even with the court partners, to, especially in a CCR setting, it really provides an opportunity, a platform to provide education to partners in that setting, so that they're all trained to be aware of what to look out for, and to be proactive and to put the responses in place before they happen. And also to work collaboratively with those court partners. And oftentimes that can be done as part of a CCR, and we'll talk about that in a minute. And also advocates must be accountable for their work to all the collaborative partners, and also in the domestic violence court. And one of the things that I train advocates on is to really be aware of your role, and also the role of everyone else, and to respect their roles the same way that you want them to respect yours, so that if someone is sort of misstepping their role or making some comments or decisions that could be jeopardizing the safety of a battered woman, to maybe take that person aside and talk to that person versus correcting them in front of others, but to have that kind of respect for one another. Unauthorized practice of important if there's advocacy training, adhere to professional boundaries, team. I think one of the is really having here about in tribal communities that sources for training critically important that all players operating that DV court is fully trained on what it means to have trauma-informed brain.
Coach, I have project on my laptop and just
Back on, Kelly. I turned my computer back on. So
okay, I'll wait till Bonnie says she can. Bonnie just finished up some grades about other victim service providers, just to identify habits again that may not be involved in every single kind and understand how to include health care, as Bonnie mentioned, counseling, if there's public transportation. Everyone, this again gets back to that, gets trained on these domestic violence, victim safety. They're called upon to be accountable to the domestic. Hopefully, everyone has agreed to certain protocols and the dedicated children and to batter account their part when they're called upon, and for ongoing and consistent particular group of people. Then there are about potential challenging. So one of the pieces, those of you who cannot see it, maybe in caps, now I'm not gonna shout it, for reporting violation with respect to the batter's actions. And Bonnie, do you want to give a few?
I think it just places outcomes to place for that, and it also creates safe situation for victims to do that. The system in place to do what they're supposed to do, that that are accountable. Look at her workplace or for her that could result in further harm and danger. Like I said before, often children batterers will use whatever they can, what have available to them to try to regain control. They're in a real precarious situation
families and tribal communities unify with their family and bonding a bit. Yeah.
You know, the success treatment and um, programs around. I want to say it's part of the historic trauma. There's starting to be a few. There's a probably good success in Rosebud Shelter. And I can't remember the name of it. It's batterers. They're all court ordered, federal court to and the name trans and what he says is that when they cut their name and with honor, you are presented with honor, and if you harm your children, then you have to be doing them regain those honors. And he batterers to see how the kind of relation with even a horse, how they interact with that interaction. So he runs that. Can't remember how long that batters, or it's like a year, or it's a long time straight as far as the recidiv. You know, it's a belief that you know, children the kind of socialization, we say vows, and it's, you know, till death. It's the reason why often statistically we say, you know, 7, 8 times that those working in a TV court, those working with that, you know, sometimes there are situations to not have them reunify with the family and change result in
The last piece recognize that this is applies that domestic violence cases are complex, require all of the collaboracy and hidden aces, as well as the complex emotional levels that are present in the case, and systemic dysfunction, and so they're going to have to recognize for their system in balance court and the core values. Protocol development, you've gotten the basic core aspects of a domestic violence simply are this. It's a set between your collaborators sharing a common goal. Usually victims, but also a commitment to these core values of each partner and privileged and sharing in a way that underscores that require peace, and it provides compatible batterer behaviors. And Bonnie wanted to do this slide. It actually came from, and it's 8-step. When I came across it, I thought it was perfect. It's very tightly worded down after the formation of the team and the existing services that a GV services are present, obtainable services. And then there should say a word about that.
Sure, this is information about each age that a battered woman may need, and also the basic information about the name of the organization, where they located, woman may need. That gets all compiled, so all of the partners have access to the battered woman, and the survey is to survey the youth and their utilization of the experience working in the court. How is it to your needs, to keeping you safe, to keep enforcement? How have they responded, and so forth? All the different agents are part of that questionnaire. Talks about her experience and done, and that can be done in an actual survey that's completed, but also community of different types of, and this is Q or elder victims, and really to get a better idea of directly. So agencies completing the survey and training and what between these two assessments, you have some really good calls. How are you going to operate? How long a battered woman, so forth, all the different agencies. So each agent, we didn't do well in this situation according to protocols. So once all the protocols and then the MOUs are protocol, they're operational, training happens so that all agencies are the other parts of the system to another's protocols and practice. That's monitored just in terms of the experience survey going. So every time law enforcement, they have that person complete even, like the size of a postcard we have done better. Round happens of the community needs assessment. Is there a need to revise our protocol information that we've received and to reflect that so that all the training is an ongoing issue. The players are continuing to be trained, credit on VAWA, on special domestic. So there's ongoing training, and then monitoring that and evaluating not CCR so that there's a system.
Other than these additional resources to the conclusion of the webinar.
I just want to quickly bring your attention to at the home.tlpi. The sexual assault response teams, we Kelly briefly discussed this in the last slide that your tribal legal code resources. We have mentioned the tribal laws, implementing the tribal laws order reauthorization with the special domestic rights for drafting or revising victim-centered tribal laws. Downloadable and free, and you can view them online. We also have a tribal protect at tribalprotectionorder.org. We also wanted to bring to your attention Groups of American Indians on Special Domestic Violence, the resource we just discussed for guide VAWA 2013. So if you get a chance, take a look at that. We highlighted it on our home.tlpi website as well. Just a listing of some of our other sexual assault and violence against women. And stick them in. If not, and you have questions later, I apologize for not putting it up. It's answer it. I can, and someone asked if we're going to get a copy of these slides out to you as soon as possible by Monday afternoon at the very. We will also be putting a link to the webinar and the slides, and we'll definitely email a copy out to everybody. I guess that would get business 24 hours. So, Bonnie or Kelly, do you have any last words?
For listening in, because of plague on our tribal communities, and make to reduce that. So thank you all for listening so patiently and working.
Very